Hey folks, my name is Roger Gonzalez, and I am a marketing consulting, a multicultural marketing consultant. I'm a publicist. I am also a college professor. And today I want to talk to you about multicultural marketing. Multicultural marketing is any marketing that attempts to reach an ethnic or cultural group based on their particular allegiance to their culture, to their background. In multicultural marketing, the business or the marketer attempts to really understand the particular group that they're trying to reach. It could be a subsegment of a larger group. For instance, it could be Japanese consumers within the larger segment of Asian American, and they try to understand not just information about that group in terms of demographics and who they are, how much they make, what their buying power is, but also in terms of their psychographic characteristics. And the differences, which I'll get to in a few minutes, of how we used to do it and how we do it now are quite drastic. It has changed tremendously. So as a multicultural marketer, for instance, the key thing is understanding the target audience that you're trying to reach. Now, there are three main groups in the U.S., okay? Considering that 40% of the entire population in the U.S. is considered multicultural, there are three main groups. The largest is the Hispanic consumer or Hispanic American. The second largest is African American, and the third is Asian American. And these are groups that live in the U.S. in different parts of the country. So geographically, we are challenged by our ability to reach these particular groups, but also in terms of understanding the nuances of each one. So when we talk to an Asian American consumer, and that Asian American consumer is Japanese, the language is different, the background is different compared to, let's say, a Chinese consumer. And China is such a large country that even within the scope of that, you might be talking to, a certain subsegment of the Chinese population. So as you can see, you could have Asian, you could have Chinese, you could have a subsegment of Chinese, you can have Japanese, which is totally different. And so as marketers, we have to understand the demographics of these particular groups, combine that with our strategy to reach that group and, how we can serve their needs and wants. But also we now, and this is where things have changed dramatically, we now have to look at the psychographic characteristics of those groups. Some groups might be more superstitious. Other groups might be more analytical. Other groups might be more emotional in how they buy. And it all depends on the particular group that you're trying to reach. In the history of multicultural marketing, and I started my career at El Diario La Prensa, first as a sales rep back in the 90s. Then I left and I came back in 1999 as the general manager of El Diario La Prensa, which is the oldest Spanish language newspaper in the country. And back in 1990, we had started to get wind of the idea. Marketers had started to get wind that this cultural segmentation was worth the investment. We started to realize that reaching these consumers was important, not just because it opened up new markets, but because they had buying power and because they represented such a large and growing portion of the population. So back in the 90s, that was a big thing. Then 2000 came along, because every 10 years you have the census, and 2000 really blew it out of the water. At this point, we realized that Hispanics had surpassed African American as the largest segment, multicultural ethnic segment in the country. And so now we had to pay attention to this group that really represented all these, different subsegments, but at least had the same language, Spanish, right? So we can reach this giant population, which represented, 15% of the total population. We can reach them if we can just take that ad and translate it to Spanish. But as we evolved, we realized that doesn't really work. And that's where psychographics comes in, because each of those groups has very particular nuances that represent that group. So just taking an ad, as we did back in the 90s and the 80s, and converting it to Spanish, or maybe taking an actor who is African American and putting him in a McDonald's commercial to represent our effort to reach the African American community, no longer really worked. We had to capture the nuances of each of those communities, and that can only happen with research, gathering data, and more importantly, really understanding the nuances of each of these groups. And one way that marketers did that and still do that is to bring in people of that particular group to help them in that understanding. You would hire people from that group to help you understand the nuances. And back then it was very driven on data. So, you had commercials which had black actors or African American actors, and they would be placed in media that was considered, targeted at that consumer. And so the connection was made that way. But media has changed dramatically, where you had days where there were tons of papers reaching African Americans, or papers like El Diario reaching Hispanics in Spanish, as well as some in English. That has changed. Back in the day, for instance, if you wanted to reach the Hispanic population, you really used Telemundo or Univision. Those are the two, Spanish language stations. If you wanted to do it in print, you would use El Diario. You could use any number of local newspapers, but you can also use the New York Daily News, which happened to reach a lot of English-speaking Hispanics. And all those media sources or media channels were very expensive, so you had to spend a lot of money often to reach these consumer groups. With 40% of all the total population today being multicultural, only about 5.5% of all the ad spending to reach those consumers is actually dedicated to that. So where 100% is spent on marketing and advertising by corporations all over the U.S., only 5.5% of that is targeted at this type of consumer. So that just gives you a sense that the opportunities are still there, but we're not really spending the kind of money. Now, back then, it was expensive. It was data-driven, meaning we were looking at demographics and we were trying to understand this market, and we were spending a lot of money. Some companies were spending a lot of money to reach these groups. Today, especially since the pandemic, we've been pushed into a very digital online world. There's, mobile marketing, there's websites, there's Facebook, there's social media, all these other ways that we can reach consumer. And one of the things that gives us as marketers is an understanding of those ethnic groups. They're giving us that information constantly. When you're posting any kind of commentary on Facebook, and you're pro Puerto Rico, or you're pro, whatever country you're pro for, whatever ethnic group or cultural background you're pro, social media is gathering that information, and we can now utilize that information. So we can target people who, for instance, might have a particular political view, or people who always, post in Spanish, or people who always talk about a particular country a lot, or their patriotism and their connection and affiliation to a particular, culture. And this is very different from that data-driven. It is data, but it's psychographic data. It's actually even cheaper in some cases to target utilizing social media than it is to spend all that money on producing a commercial and placing it, for instance, in Telemundo or Univision. Now we can create content a lot easier, specifically targeted at those groups. So I can create, for instance, any number of videos on the history of Domino's, or the history of, how to make Cuban sandwiches, anything like that. And it's going to reach a particular group. So we can create content a lot easier than we could back in the day, and place it in front of those people utilizing social media and utilizing the internet and AdWords and things like that. Whereas in the past, it was really about media-driven channels. And even though these are media, they work a little bit differently than they did in the past. As far as the future is concerned, we being multicultural markets, will surpass the 50% mark in the U.S. And hopefully a lot of these marketers will begin to realize the potential of marketing to these consumers and focus a lot of their dollars into doing that. One nuance that we're discovering, two nuances actually, is that as we complete the 2020 census, because the census was cut short because of the recession and the pandemic and all the other things that are affecting us, it may be that a lot of information is missing from the next 2020 census. It may be that we're not getting a full, accurate representation of these ethnic communities, and this will hurt a lot of those communities. It will hurt local government because funding will be cut from that local government if the information doesn't prove that these communities exist. So that's one thing. The other thing that is very strong is that now, instead of just reaching a, I'd say, Spanish dominant Latino family, we might be reaching families that have let's say one partner might be Latino or Latina and the other partner might be African American or Asian. So there's been this mix of multiple cultures, right, that could end up in a household, and we have to define how we reach that. So keep in mind that Latinx member of that family is probably going to be on social media doing what they find engaging, whereas the let's say the African American member of that family may be doing something slightly different based on their taste. And that's going to be the challenge for us moving forward, is how do we continue to reach these ethnic groups? They each have different needs, different wants, and they are still valuable to us. As Seth Godin says, mass marketing is over. If you get a chance, read This is Marketing by Seth Godin, or just go and Google some of his videos. And he talks about how mass marketing has ended, and now businesses can be very successful by reaching just a small group of very loyal customers that they can serve. And maybe those loyal customers might be of an ethnic background. So whatever your business is and whatever you're trying to do, take a look at the multicultural makeup of your clientele and the potential of what your clientele could be from a multicultural perspective, and find ways to reach them. Roger Gonzalez, and if you have any questions, this is my email. You can email me anytime you like, and I'd love to have a conversation and some feedback as far as multicultural marketing is concerned.